let's get started and let people drift in as they will, particularly online. I suspect they'll start to filter in a little bit more. But it gives me absolute pleasure to welcome you all to the October CRADLE Seminar. I had to pause for a moment to remember what month it was because it's been that kind of a year. And of course, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered. In this place, we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and those yet to come. I also acknowledge the land has never been ceded. And also say that where we are here at Deakin Downtown is on the border of two countries. So the river, which is somewhere over, oh my God, I have no sense of direction. It is somewhere over there, isn't it? I'm waving randomly. I could have been waving at the, north. The river is the boundary of the Boon Wurrung and the Wurundjeri people, but of course that river has moved and changed over time and over years. So it's also customary or sort of respectful, I suppose, to acknowledge the Boon Wurrung people as well too while you're here, and that's the country that I'm from. So it gives me the most enormous pleasure to introduce Ros Black to you. His seminar is Nostalgic Stories and Academic Imaginaries of the Digital, a project that she did her CRADLE Fellowship on and one that I was very closely involved with. And I've got Ros's bio here, and I'm going to go off script, which always ends badly because I get very focused. But Ros is someone I've worked with for a couple of years now. She's I suppose officially a senior lecturer in Deakin, but that label does not give any credit to her thoughtfulness, her incisiveness, her ability to grasp deeply issues around education, I think, about ways of being, and on top of all of that, she's an absolute pleasure to work with. So can I introduce to you Ros Black for her CRADLE seminar?
Thank you, Margaret. Woof, very kind of you. Now, can I just do a volume check? Because I can't hear from here. Is that comfortable for everyone? Yes? All right, you tell me if it's not. I'd just like to start off at the bottom of that slide by acknowledging and thanking Margaret and Rolla for being and actually continuing to be the most extraordinary academic mentors. It's a very lovely thing at my stage in life and career to have a mentor, and actually to have two mentors. It's been a complete joy, and I've just had so much out of this fellowship altogether, and that mentorship is a very important part of it. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge my three research fellows whose time I was able to purchase with the funding of the fellowship, Rachel Finneran, Maeve Noonan, and especially Caridwen Owen, who's continuing to work with me to publish and present out of this fellowship, and I'll come back to that later. So I'm sharing just a few of the findings of my 2022-2023 fellowship. And what I'm going to do this afternoon is to take one slice out of our data story to reflect on what nostalgic academic imaginaries might be shaping our relationship to, our attitudes to, our engagement with, our orientation towards what I'm calling, in a nutshell, digital teaching within higher education, and what those imaginaries might mean for the academics who narrate and shape and craft and inform them, but also for the sector as a whole, for the academy as a whole. So to briefly explain digital teaching, it's not actually something I'm going to go into a lot of detail about. I'm going to establish it in this presentation more as a given rather than something that I'm unpacking. What I mean quite simply is I'm referring particularly to the wholesale sectoral, really international move to what is sometimes called online teaching. I'm calling it digital teaching because that slightly better captures the hybrid possibilities and the various ways in which digital technologies, practices and pedagogies are being employed, especially and have been employed through the last few years. So I think we're all pretty familiar with the fact, I think it's safe to say, that those digital teaching practices, pedagogies, tools, technologies have really become integral to the way in which most of us in higher education, in the teaching space, do business. Of course, that's been very, radically expanded by the events of the last few years, by the pandemic. We all know, and the work of many people in the room has done an enormous amount to document the fact that in some universities, in some groups, in some schools, in some faculties, digitally enabled teaching was already well underway, but it was by no means as universal as it has now become. Whether that will ever kind of turn backwards is something that Dave and others have written about. But I'm really talking about the present moment and our imaginaries of the future going forward. So what interested me at the start of my fellowship was that even though, and this is 2021, 2022, I was starting to engage with this really deeply in the pandemic context still, I was interested in the fact that despite that kind of wholesale adoption of digital practices, there was still a very strong concern, one that hasn't really showed any particular tendencies to slow down or to disappear. There have been concerns, and again, I'm not here this afternoon to, try and encapsulate the vast literature of the last few years that's raised concerns about issues of connection and locatedness and the changes to academic identity and practice, the opportunities and the concerns or threats that some people perceive in the digital. What I've been particularly interested in from the outset is one particular line of thought within the critical commentary of the digital in higher education, which raises or questions the degree to which the centrality of the digital in higher education teaching is shaped by certain shared stories, certain collective or social imaginaries. We saw that literature, we saw that critical concern start to emerge, particularly during the pandemic years. But I think it's a theme or a thread that's continuing to garner scholarly interest. And so what we're seeing is, I think, the gradual rise or emergence of a body of scholarship that builds on the theory or the idea of the social imaginary. The social imaginary has been quite a strong touchstone within the scholarship of higher education over the last 2 decades or so. So you see work that draws on a number of scholars, mostly the ones that I've mentioned here, to really try and unpack and interrogate the forces shaping higher education as a system and as a sector, its policies, its practices, its pedagogies, but also the way that academics are living and experiencing and understanding themselves and their work within that. I want to talk briefly about how we within this particular project understand the social imaginary, in particular, the academic social imaginary. So drawing on fairly recent scholarship, as well as some seminal work, such as that by Fazl Rizvi, and leaning into Margaret's work with other colleagues very heavily as well, we're framing the academic social imaginary as a shared story of our social world. Thank you, Margaret, such a beautiful phrasing. That shapes and is shaped by common or shared or agreed practices, images, stories, myths, values, that really provides the common frameworks of belief within which we understand our identities as academics, our work, and our current and future practices going forward. The social imaginary, the academic social imaginary, or an academic social imaginary, because there are many, is very much grounded or based in the repeated, daily, accustomed behaviours and roles and experiences of the academy. But it's not set in stone. It's fluid, it's generative, as Margaret and her colleagues have pointed out. It responds to, it shifts with, it morphs with both the social, political and cultural contexts of the academy, and also the wider political and social forces which shape those contexts within which they interact. So it's never independent of the academic zeitgeist of the time, but it might help shift or change that zeitgeist over time. What we learn from Taylor's work in particular is that a social imaginary, in this case an academic social imaginary, is therefore not so much a set of ideas, rather it's something, it's a force that enables things to happen. So within the academy, any given social imaginary can do a number of things. It can reflect and enshrine and kind of lock in or hold hegemonic educational purposes and assumptions and practices. But, and I'm citing the literature to indicate these ideas are not coming out of my head, they are coming out of the emerging scholarship. There's also a very strong view, an emerging view, that a social imaginary within the academy can also serve as a way of prompting or proposing alternative possibilities, alternative academic hegemonies, that it can offer performative potential, opportunity for academics to work together to create meaning, to reframe the meaning and the purpose of their work, both in the present and in the future. So there's this growing work, only some of which I've cited here, which basically presents an argument. It argues that the imaginary, the social imaginary, the shared story of the academy that we create and craft together can also be a way in which we can work together to co-create the future of the academy and our work. So you'll notice the past couple of minutes I've been talking about the future. With the future, we're talking about going forward, we're talking about looking forward and looking ahead. But actually what I started to see in the literature is a surprisingly strong and solid and sort of not resistant, but anyway, a strong nostalgia. The literature is smaller, but I feel that it's still nonetheless something that's strongly present. There's this sort of, at the same time as there continue to be critical concerns about the centrality of the digital in higher education teaching, there's this kind of nostalgia, and I really feel that it's still unpacking, still emerging, still coming. It's a nostalgia for the past, for academic life and practice, and sense of academic self in the past. It's often framed in terms of things that have been lost or that academics feel have been lost. This is a very felt and affective space, which I'll be speaking to more shortly. So you see this nostalgia coming out of the literature again. You can see from the dates, particularly the literature that was emerging really in the depths of the pandemic, that talked about, the digital as a threat to collective and connected academic experiences and identities. But as I say, I think that narrative is still emerging. I think it's still coming. I think it's still growing. If we look at that nostalgia a little critically, there are some arguments that academic nostalgia, in particular this kind of nostalgia that pushes against the digital, is maybe simply, a kind of romantic reinvestment in past places and practices and subjectivities, or even a romantic reinvestment in a past that never really happened. So there's a definite argument that we have a kind of imaginary of the past in academia that is maybe a rose-tinted one, that maybe describes something that was never really in place in the first place. But it's interesting, there's also, Niemeyer and Uhl talk about the possibility of an anticipatory nostalgia, which means that our imaginaries, our thoughts, our feelings, our memories, real or constructed of the past, actually imbue not just the past but the future with a sense of loss or a sense of anxiety or a sense of yearning. So I'm talking about the slightly dark side of academic nostalgia. There's another argument that says that it can actually be a very productive thing. So you've got this argument, and again, I think it's still sort of coming, I think it's still being played out, that a critical nostalgia can help us think, you know, really sort of shed light on what we are doing within the sector at the moment, and can be a way of protecting what might be fundamental beliefs or first principles about the purpose of higher education. So you've got that sort of nostalgia as a retreat, maybe, nostalgia as an emotional safe place, but also perhaps nostalgia as a productive tool or process. So let me take you back to the project itself. So my CRADLE Fellowship project was framed around 3 key research questions. What shared or social imaginaries shape the recent and future development and implementation of digital teaching in Australian and United Kingdom universities? And what's discursively produced by these imaginaries? How do very senior academics who have a role in shaping these imaginaries look back to understand teaching practice before the advent of the pandemic and that big move to digital teaching, and how do they look forward, both to imagine their own academic futures and the future of the sector as a whole? When you look at the literature, the enormous wave of literature that came out, particularly during the first couple of years of the pandemic, most of that literature, rightly and understandably, focused very much on teaching academics. So academics who were really located at that bleeding edge of digital teaching, practice and pedagogy. A much smaller number, in fact, I found 2 studies, which I've leaned into very strongly, and thank you, Dave, for one of these, has really sort of, you know, took a step sideways to the side and explored the perspectives of a range of academics, including senior academics. And that's the position or the choice that I've taken within this fellowship. In making that choice, you know, we recognise that imaginaries, social imaginaries, can be created or fostered in particular by people who are in power, in positions of power or influence. So we created a final purposive sample of 11 academics, quite a small group, drawn from a range of Australian and UK universities and a range of disciplinary areas. It's worth noting that I had a lot of knockbacks. I had a lot of nil replies. These are exceptionally busy people with enormous loads and responsibilities, so that was no particular surprise. But in the end, 11 people kindly consented to participate in the study. Just to answer maybe one of the first questions, why Australia and the UK? 2 simple reasons for that choice. Because universities in both nations adopted that, you know, were really sort of embraced, if you like, responded to the necessities of the pandemic and really adopted that digital teaching approach very quickly, very early on. But also a lot of the literature that I'm citing today comes from Australia and the UK. There just seems to be something in both nations that has really kind of generated a critical commentary. In most instances, in the end, we approached academics who were known to us or to our colleagues. We did also use a little bit of snowballing. When people were too busy, we asked them to refer us to their colleagues. And sometimes it was a 6th or 7th generation person who said yes. Who were they ultimately? So senior, seasoned academics, if I can use that phrase. They were and are deans, heads of faculties, heads of schools, emeritus or emerita professors, distinguished professors, directors of centres, almost universally, recognised scholars in the field that we were investigating. They are often of more than 30 years standing in the academy. So what I'm proposing is that they present both a view from the top and a kind of long view of the academy. We used Braun and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis framework to interrogate and analyse the data, mainly because it recognised data analysis as a really generative process that I felt fitted very well with the idea of a social imaginary. Just before I go on to talk about what we actually interpreted from the data, I just want to muse on the methodology for a moment. So again, these are very, very senior, very experienced people who've been in the sector for a very long time. Almost by definition, most of them at the time of our interviews were holding roles that might have sort of positioned them as being responsible for the rollout of digital teaching and practice within their school or faculty or centre or university, but very few had direct teaching responsibilities any longer. So in some ways, they're inoculated, that's my language, not theirs, against that sort of everyday teaching experience, you know, the academic who's being thrown into the digital or choosing to jump in. They were sort of distanced from that, and that was something that they acknowledged very quickly. Some of them described themselves as being lucky or shielded from that impact of that, you know, that sort of really rapid shift in practice. And one of the things that worried us a little bit, and certainly Margaret and Rolla, you know, put that forward as a question, and it was a really good question. Would these people actually provide us with or present a viewpoint that was almost like too removed and too dispassionate for our purposes? Would their many, many years in predicting and analysing and informing and leading education policy and practice make them sort of resilient to the kind of affective responses that the scholarship was just dripping with? But in fact, and it was something of a surprise, I mean, I went ahead with the methodology regardless, but carrying that concern with me. Surprisingly, still surprises me in some ways, most of those conversations, you know, that they emerged, they were very, very deeply felt. One of my interviewees wept during the interview. They were very affective. They were sort of full of a range of different emotions. I've listed them, you know, grief, fury, hope, despair, often impatience, often indignation, sometimes a kind of tolerant amusement of their colleagues. But they were very, very sensitive to the fact that other academics often feel the digital teaching space as an affective space. So 11 different people working in very different universities, in different settings, in different geographical locations with different roles. But we felt that out of their accounts, there were nonetheless 3 very consistent imaginaries of the digital in higher education teaching. And each of these imaginaries, I'm suggesting, engages with, in different ways, with the ideas of academic nostalgia, but also the desire for connection, something that I'm going to unpack and explain as I go on. So what were the 3 nostalgic imaginaries or academic imaginaries that we interpreted out of these 11 interviews? The first is what we end up calling the pull of the past. I don't know that naming things is my great talent in life, so that's what we have at the moment. It was or is like a really haunted, nostalgic imaginary which sort of associates the digital with that loss that I talked about a moment ago, the loss or the impoverishment of connection in particular. They were what we're calling the launching pad. It's a more hopeful, it's a more replete imaginary, where the digital is a way of enhancing connection, of enhancing and strengthening connective educational practices, places, and pedagogies. And the third one we're calling the untethered future. It was an imaginary, or is an imaginary which we felt sort of looks beyond the familiar, either to critique the limitations which arise from academic nostalgia. All of this will become clear as I unpack the data for you, and or to imagine new connected educational futures. So let me talk briefly to each of those imaginaries. I'm not going to unpack the narrative of 11 people in relation to each of these. What I'm doing this afternoon is just making some little selections. So let's go back to that first imaginary, the pull of the past. As I said a moment ago, it's one that associates the digital with the loss or the impoverishment of previous forms of social and material connection within the university and the teaching space. And I felt that that imaginary really came most strongly out of the narrative or the account of one particular person. I have to say, this was actually the academic who wept during her interview. I have done everything I possibly can to protect the identities of my participants, but I also wanted to give you just a tiny sense of who they are, because their biography, their professional journey and experience is really integral to how they speak and see and relate and spoke to us. So Melba Sond, based in the UK, her scholarship includes, over the last few years, like a really in-depth analysis of that move to digital teaching and how it impacted and affected academics. She joined the academy in her 30s. She holds a senior role, as they all do, this time within an educational institute in a large capital city university. When I asked her to think back to her early experiences as an academic, what she recounted was, what she sort of evoked, was this foundational experience of the university as a really rich socio-material environment, one which, as she says, was very intensive, very embodied, very material, and also very relational. And her deep concern is that by comparison with that, the contemporary academy, especially as she observes it in the United Kingdom, is undergoing what she calls a structural erosion of opportunities for relationality. So she says, it seems more isolated than it used to be. And I think not only does that affect the work itself, the ideas, the discussions aren't happening. To me, it feels quite stripped out now. It feels that there's a lot of richness that's been lost. And she associates, or she attributes, a lot of that loss to the advent or that kind of wholesale move to the digital within the teaching space. So this is what she says. A sense of alienation and atomization, a lack of any real sense of a very impoverished form of connectedness is something that characterises online teaching. She says, I intensely dislike online teaching, no matter how creative or so on it can be. So she's looking back to an academic reality that she feels has been lost. When we asked her to look ahead to the possible future of the sector, that nostalgia was still there all the way through. So when we ask her to kind of predict or imagine the future of the academy, this is what she describes. And it's quite dark. A hollowed out, stripped away, impoverished academy if we're not careful. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think that's the risk. Let me go on to the second imaginary. So this for us was like a sort of intermediate space. It's more hopeful. Within it, our participants who spoke to this imaginary, the launching pad, describe the digital, they position the digital within teaching as a means of enhancing or extending established and familiar and connective educational pedagogies. They evoke a future which really harnesses the evolving potential of the digital, but that kind of keeps faith with, keeps a continuity with established educational principles. You can see it's a very balanced, I suppose, kind of position, but it's also, we called it the launching pad because it's like standing on familiar ground, but looking ahead to what might evolve and what might come. I'm sharing briefly with you the accounts of 3 academics who we felt really spoke to this imaginary. So John in the UK, he's got a lead role in the Centre for Higher Education Research, and he believes that digital teaching has got great potential. But he also says this, that potential is nothing unless you have a carefully designed curriculum that's actually designed for the particular students who are studying. I mean, that's probably like a 101 principle for a lot of people in this room, but, you know, very much is. When we ask him to think ahead, to look ahead, to imagine ahead to the future, he speaks to this very established educational imaginary. It's one that privileges personalised teaching, connected teaching, and the sharing of knowledge with students in ways that are empowering for those students. So he says, for me, the technology is never the driving force. The driving force is always giving particular students access to particular bodies of knowledge. But he worries. They all worry. He worries that at the moment in the academy, in the UK, speaking mostly for his university, but also kind of looking across the sector a bit more broadly, he worries that everything is seen through the lens of technology at the moment, rather than through the lens of what we're trying to achieve educationally. And he warns that going forward, he believes that kind of thinking is really dangerous. He says it completely takes away the educational expertise of academics. Let's go to Marcus here in Australia. So he's an academic, he's been working in this space for a long time. He's held roles in the past that have really placed him at what was at the time the kind of leading or cutting edge of digital education practice. But when you if you can boil his interview down, it ends up being all about human interaction, about the people. And he explains that his experience during the pandemic, our experience during the pandemic, was a real catalyst for this. So he says, I think about how much things have changed, and look, we can't predict the change. But this really does bring pause for reflection about that which we as human beings bring to higher education. Because one thing we know is that people and collegiality really matter during these times. Quite a lot of our participants, our interviewees, I mean, they're reasonably long interviews. I'm only presenting a sort of smidgen here. There was a kind of conversation about the promises, the promissory discourses of the digital in higher education, the utopian or sometimes dystopian discourses, again, work that Margaret and her colleagues have done a huge amount on. And he speaks about that as well. Like quite a few of the other participants, he says, look, these sort of promissory discourses, these utopian discourses of digital teaching, they're mostly a fraud. But instead of making that into a problem, he sort of frames it as an opportunity for a return to core educational principles. So he says, I don't think anyone would get away with those utopian claims about the digital anymore, about the educational application of technology. And the optimist in me thinks that skepticism is healthy, and I think it will help us to think through what we really want out of this technology. So even a critique of those kind of utopian discourses for Marcus swings around and becomes the basis for thinking critically and creatively about what the digital can do in the teaching space, in the educational space. Really like the others, Vanessa, still in Australia, she describes herself as a long-time watcher of educational technology. As I said, these people have been in the space really usually from the very beginning. And in fact, her role at the moment in her Australian university makes her pretty much responsible for the adoption of digital teaching technologies within her faculty. So like John and Marcus, she thinks that the chief challenge for the academy is to wrangle the technologies so that we can still maintain the essence of teaching and learning. So like all of the academics who embrace this kind of launching pad imaginary, it's like their feet are on the familiar ground of first educational principles, but they're willing and able to kind of dream ahead into the possibilities represented by the technology. And she really argues for that balanced perspective. She says, look, technologies always disappoint, but actually often they're better than what we thought they were going to be as well. We did talk to some of our participants about this theory, this idea, this suggestion that there's a very nostalgic theme or thread or discourse or imaginary running through the sector at the moment. And Vanessa's very sympathetic to that. She talks about the nostalgia that's in the hearts of people who think that academic identity is under threat, largely because of the move to the digital. But she also cautions against going too deeply into that dark narrative, the narrative that it's all going to hell in a handbasket. What she does instead is that she looks forward to a future. I sort of like this. She's looking ahead to a future informed by what she calls a shift back. So it's like this little temporal dance that a lot of the participants were doing. I'm thinking of the future. I hope it will actually be a shift back to pedagogical grassroots, to pedagogical continuities, where academics can both adopt and adapt digital technologies for the best educational outcomes. Let me take you to the third and final imaginary, the one that we call the untethered future. So this is the imaginary that we interpret to be one that sort of looks beyond the future. So again, the first imaginary is locked back into what is known. The second one is doing a dance with the familiar and the possibilities of the future. The third one just takes a running leap into that possible future, to imagine new educational futures enabled by the digital. We saw this imaginary in a number of different ways in our participants' accounts. There was quite a strong theme that was about an imagined future for the academy where digital technologies enable the exchange of learning and teaching and knowledge that transcends time and space, takes us right out of the situated, located, familiar spaces of the academy. But we also see it in accounts which actually turn back against that nostalgia that I've described, which question and critique the limitations to the future that might be arising from academic nostalgia, as well as other forces. So Isaac in Australia is a lifelong academic. He has a history that spans national and regional settings. He's worked as an analyst, an advisor, a scholar in the policies and the politics of higher education. And he draws on, again, this really strong temporal theme right through our work. He draws on memories of pedagogical approaches that span decades. He said, I'm a child of the 60s. And what he speaks to, but at the same time, what he speaks to is the potential of the digital to connect learners in new ways. As he says, ways where time and space become totally irrelevant. And you learn in groups which are constructed not in terms of national spaces of learning or local spaces of learning, but truly transnational spaces of learning. He has this enormous vision of the sort of, well, the untethered possibilities of the digital in terms of what they can enable. He also worries that academics as a collective are being hobbled or held back by what he calls a nostalgia of the constructed past. And you can see he's speaking there to that scholarship that says there's a really strong and resilient nostalgia about a past that never really existed. And he, like quite a few of the participants, worries that that nostalgia is getting in the way of realizing the potential of the digital. At the same time, and working with this data is like, on the one hand, on the other hand, and now I need a third hand, and now I need a fourth. He's still concerned, he's concerned nonetheless, about the potential of digital technologies, practices, pedagogies to determine the nature of our work, then the nature of teaching, and maybe even the nature of knowledge as well, and what is valuable knowledge. So there's this constant, it's not ambivalence, it's something more sophisticated than that, but it's like a dance with the possibilities and the risks. Jumping back to the United Kingdom, Cliff is similarly concerned. He's worried that the realization of digital teaching possibilities, what the digital promises, what it could be, is being held back by what I'm calling, I hope you like the alliteration, a temporal torpidity. I don't know, it worked for me, within the academy. And he really worries, as a few of our participants do, but this is privileging the past at the expense of the future. So a lot like Isaac, he says, you know, academics are still looking back dreamy-eyed over some halcyon recollection of things that just probably actually never really were. His scholarship, and if I named him, and I won't, but most people in the room would know it really well, you know, when the digital, when that shift, when that overnight kind of move to the digital emerged in 2020, 2021, he was one of its harshest critics. He is remains one of the academics who's been one of the scholars who's been most concerned about the challenges of the digital to established academic practices and identities. But at the same time, and here I go again, he has this optimism. He has this optimism that digital pedagogies could become much more enabling and creative as they mature, or you might say as they are allowed to mature. He says the future of this stuff is, I think, much more exciting in terms of where things go, where this goes. At the same time, boy, do I need another phrase, he worries that the Academy, especially in the UK, and it's worth really noting that the narratives of our participants in the UK were much darker. And it's not really hard to understand, much darker than those of our Australian interviewees. So he worries that the Academy is suffering from what he calls a critical lethargy or an ennui, which has caused a sense of hopelessness, almost a resignation of agency that we can't affect change to higher education, including that change that might realise the potential, the full potential of the digital. I hope you like my timey-wimey references. Any Doctor Who fans in the room? Including thoughts and a drink of water. Okay, kind of summing it up and wrapping it up and trying to make sense of it all. I mean, one of the things that really stood out for us, and you can hear it in my presentation, is that there are no neat answers to either the past or the future. For me, one of the biggest questions, without any particular answer at the moment, is what might our participants, these these senior academic leaders in higher education, what might they be mobilising through the imaginaries that we interpret in their accounts? One of the things that's really clear is that there are no neat answers and no neat consensus. Even with individual interviews, as I think I've already shown, you can see that ambivalence. about the impact and the potential of digital teaching, about the future of the academy, about the role of nostalgia even in academic imaginaries of the past, the present and the future. I think it's safe to say that for some of our participants, like Melvison, academic nostalgias are really essential emotional space. It's like an evocation of academic first principles. It's something that has to be held to and held on to. For some, in that sort of second launching pad imaginary space, that nostalgia's got real productive potential to inform new, connected and creative pedagogies through the digital. But for others, it's a hampering influence getting in the way of digital futures. So no neat answers. A second thing that came out of our conversations, got to stop using my hands when I talk, especially with Rolla and Margaret, was that our participants really seem to understand this work of these tensions, the work of grappling with these tensions, with the absence of neat answers. They actually position that work as essential or integral academic labour. They sort of, what do? They run to it, they embrace it. And I was really interested in the very strong link between their accounts and the literature that I referred to before and here as well. That zeitgeist that I described earlier, which is really, I think, increasingly urging and encouraging academics to work together. And I'm just going to quote from a couple of the, richer papers recently, to take on, and I mean, listen to the language of it, to take on the task of articulating confident alternative imaginaries for the future of teaching in universities, to rewild, I love that one, to rewild higher education pedagogies in ways that are unfettered by current imaginaries, and more specifically to this space, to invent new social imaginaries of digitalization in higher education. What we also see is very strongly in our participants' accounts, this consistent argument or even hope for a really collective collegial academic investment in this work of imagining, in this work of reimagining. If we go back to Cliff, he really urges the academy to move to that space that exists in between the dystopian and the utopian, to take ownership of academic labour and the digital within it. But there's Vanessa saying, she hopes that we can all be together much more agentic and sophisticated and collective about what role technology plays. At the same time, there's this sort of argument that academics need to cultivate their own shared stories about who we are at a time of change and flux in the academy. So Cliff says, crucially, at a fundamental level, there's something here where we need to have a discussion of what it is. What is it to be an academic? Meaning to be an academic now. And also to resist any threats to academics' capacity to do this work, especially from policy actors and big ed tech companies. That was quite a strong theme, who in Isaac's words, have the power to do a huge amount of imaginary construction and may drive us towards prioritising certain narratives and certain imaginaries. The big act of imagination, really something in the end that all of our participants in their various ways, regardless of where they were coming from, whether they were coming from a position of grief, whether they were coming from a kind of tempered hope, whether they were coming from a slightly despairing impatience with, the nature of the academy at the moment. There was this constant urging towards imagining and reimagining. And I have to end with the words of James Bond. So a long-time passionate advocate across Australian and international contexts for the potential of the digital, especially to enable that connectivity which some of our participants clearly feel is under threat. I thought his final words, they were the final words of in his interview, and they're my final words because I thought they were just beautiful. Change occurs all around us, and the question is, do we actually accept that the change is there and do something about it, or do we avert our eyes and look in another direction? So this is the big challenge, that we need to look at the change and imagine the possibilities rather than avert our gaze. That's the big act of imagination that's required, to actually stare it in the face. My very last little slide is just, so I'm moving away. I've finished my data presentation now, and I just wanted to end very briefly by reflecting on, as I have before in a couple of forums, the value and the preciousness of this fellowship to me and to the colleagues who've worked with me, but really for me. So we are now working furiously to publish and disseminate what we've found through the fellowship. We've just have the very first submitted paper, only to Q1 journals, has come back with some revisions, but I think Margaret will back me up. Pretty good comments, really. Yeah. The editor even wrote a personal note saying, really like this. So as soon as I'm back from leave, I'm actually on leave at the moment, but as soon as I'm back from leave, we'll do the revisions and hopefully that will be published quite soon. There are 2 more papers in the pipeline, pretty significantly progressed, but not quite there yet. And we have been presenting our little hearts out. So in late November, we're presenting at Deacon's ADI conference on this work. There have been some internal presentations, but also a couple of solid conference presentations. So it's just my way of saying thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the fellowship. Thank you for the ongoing relationship. I have to say, I'm just going to kind of tell the story that, you know, when I told my husband what I was doing today, he said, I thought that fellowship was, aren't you finished that yet? And I was like, it's an ongoing relationship. And I truly love and value and appreciate the fact, because that's a fairly unusual, it's a fairly rare opportunity to be able to, not to be made to walk away when the formal work is done. And also just want to say to my CRADLE colleagues, yes, we are getting it out there. So thank you.
So we have time for some questions. Thank you, folks. And thanks very much to Ros. I mean, you can see why I talked about her incisiveness and insightfulness in the introduction. The format, which I didn't mention before, is this. We will have a few questions now from online on the floor. If there's further interest, we'll keep on going, but I'll close the forum at the 3 p.m. mark, which is, I think, not very far away now. So I think we've got time for maybe 1 or maybe 2 questions before I bring it to a formal close. Anything online or in the room? Amina.
I just wanted to ask if anyone discussed how their imaginary may have shifted, or what it would take for it to shift one way or the other between dystopian and if they didn't talk about it, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a very nice question. Okay, so in a sense, I suppose the imaginaries were interpreted by us, and we didn't really present to, you know, we didn't sort of suggest to them that they were speaking to a particular imaginary, we're more listening. I mean, certainly a lot of them talked about the way in which their thoughts, their feelings, their engagement, their imaginary, you know, the way in which they imagine the future is changing or has changed. But I think that they were also very much speaking, I mean, as I said, these are people who represent a kind of a very long view of the academy. I mean, they have, you know, seen so much, you might say seen it all. And a lot of their narratives were about the change and flux that they and other academics and the sector as a whole has gone through over time. but it was kind of described as something that's, emerged over decades. So not only the move to the digital, but the different political contexts and settings that have changed and are still shaping and changing the nature of higher education. Where you sort of saw the darkest note, I suppose, was where they were really cautioning against that imposition of political or politicised responses, strategies that they felt, really could be a threat to the academy as we know it going forward.
I think we've got one question online.
Yep, we've got one online. This question comes from Penny Wheeler, and this question came in at 2, so it's that first half of the presentation. And Penny said, thank you. You've just given one reason for why these two contexts, the UK and the Australian universities, should be considered together in terms of their comparable adoption of digital teaching. I'm wondering whether the project considered whether the UK is still, in brackets still with a question mark, a mythic site for its quote unquote daughter universities. For its
daughter university.
Yeah. Yes, and I'm going to infer, Penny, you can feel free to put a comment in the chat about that, but I think what Penny means by daughter universities is the Australian universities being a younger set of institutions.
Yeah. So there was, and I'm not quite sure whether this is what Penny's speaking to. We did actually get into quite a conversation with a number of participants about the, again, almost like the iconic, the original, the slightly mythic imaginary of higher education. I mean, particularly with our UK participants, we were sort of talking about, the Oxbridge dream, which in some way, which in fact quite a few of our participants sort of offer, and it's often comes out of the scholarship as well. The oak door, the tutor, the student, the face-to-face, the located, the situated, the beautiful campus, the long conversations. This is often offered as a kind of dream-like, the halcyon, the days, the experience that's been lost. And it's often contrasted, to the move to digital teaching. But what most of my participants were keen to do was to explode that as a myth. So they tended to talk about the dominance, the prevalence, the resistance, the resilience of that image, of that imaginary of the university, but as something that was rarely true, even at the best of times, that was incredibly inequitable, that was unavailable to most learners, and that actually shouldn't be held as a kind of touchstone for the academy going forward.
Thanks so much, Ros. I'm aware we're at time, so we'll keep on going with questions in the room, anyone who's online, but I will ask you now to thank Ros once again in the usual fashion for a fabulous seminar, and to let you know that on the 5th of December, I think, we will be having our next seminar about a project. What's it entitled, Jo? Jo is giving it.
I've only just sent the details through, but it'll be a House of Cards, ? Equity Students' Experiences of Navigating University.
Brilliant. And on that note, we will go back to questions again. Thanks all for coming. Anyone who wants to slip out now can. I think there was Laura and then Dave. Ros, you're not off the hook yet.
Thanks, Ros. I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things you mentioned, and thank you also for a really thoughtful presentation. You pointed to change as a constant, and also continuous.
Sorry, can I just check? There are still people online. Can they hear?
Excuse me. Well, just in case, I'm soft-spoken. You pointed to change being a constant, and you also pointed to, I suppose, the social and political context of the work that you're doing. I wondered if you'd thought about that broader positioning of it, and the fact that over the period that these people have been working in higher education, the digital technologies have changed hugely, but there's been lots of other changes as well. And the commercialization, and I suppose the entrenchment of higher education as a neoliberal kind of monolith with the student as consumer has been a fairly significant change too, you might be able to say. I've wondered if your participants spoke to that or grappled with that as being one of those things that might be driving or contributing to those emotional responses.
Yeah, absolutely. So I only addressed that with 3 words in my presentation. I talked about, the move to digital being a major contributor to changes in academic practice and other forces. And the other forces that was code for really a very extensive discussion. I mean, you could do a whole project or hold a whole presentation just on that, about, as you say, the massification of higher education, the commercialisation of higher education, the really dramatic, the rise or I suppose under the heading of commercialisation, the kind of the role of, large ed tech companies, the kind of policies that have created the space for those companies to play the increasing role that they are. There was a very big discussion and acknowledgement and recognition and critique of forces that went way beyond the digital, as drivers, as shapers, as framing forces, framing conditions, for the contemporary academic experience. I've chosen not to focus. I mean, I've picked them up in some of the papers. I chose not to focus on them here because I was trying to sort of like not boil the ocean. But very much that recognition that, in fact, although I've focused on the little kind of central piece, but the move to digital teaching and everything that that means, and that it in itself not being a monolithic experience. There's a very strong recognition that's taken place in the context of wider and more complex movements and changes.
We might go to another one online. This question is from Matthew Hillier. And Matthew says, it seems a lot of the discourse is from those outside the online/distance ed space, where in the latter solid work has been done on rethinking pedagogy for online and tech-enhanced education spaces. Some examples being COI by Garrison and colleagues, 5 Stages mode by Salmon in the UK, and others that escape my current memory. Matthew says, suffice to say that the core is about building curriculum and pedagogy to match the context rather than trying to ram face-to-face paradigms into the digital/online space. Curious if there was any references or sources from the distance/online ed research base.
Yeah, so very much. So quite a few of the participants sort of began their engagement with the digital through distance education. A couple of them, and again, I can't sort of say too much without the risk of identifying people, but a couple of them, one is still working in a space where in Australia, where distance education is it was the generative, it was the genesis for the digital practices, the digital pedagogies that are now being, employed more widely across the school or faculty. Quite a lot of them talk with, even Melisande. So Melisande was the grief-filled, very disenchanted academic who says bluntly, I intensely dislike online teaching. She actually goes on to say, except where distance teaching or distance education is involved or is in the offering. She says that's the great exception because that is the key to access and equity. So there was a lot of very positive discussion about the possibility of distance education. There was the recognition of distance as a kind of seeding practice in many contexts for the more developed, technological pedagogies that have emerged. What else can I say?
Can I ask a question? Oh no, Dave, you're next.
Yes, I'd like to ask a different kind of question. which is about the positioning of research of this kind and the work that it does.
So
It's very interesting to hear about this and to kind of imagine ourselves in that space. But do you see this kind of research as having some pragmatic value in moving us forward in some way? And if so, what do you think that might be?
So this project was framed from the beginning. Actually, I mustn't put things in the passive tense. So I or we framed this project from the very beginning, very deliberately, very consciously, as an investigation of something quite intangible. So in fact, it wasn't framed and has never sort of, in a sense, claimed to be a project whose findings might directly inform practice. Rather, it was, so it started off from that recognition, as I said, of the kind of scholarly anguish that just seemed to be, still kind of floating, floating through the zeitgeist, and a real desire to unpack and understand where that was coming from, what might be driving it. I hope that the kind of, if you like, that hopeful note, that kind of exhortation, that encouragement to academics to critically think about, to put educational practices and purposes first, to be creative, to work together, to resist what they feel needs to be resisted and embrace what, needs to be embraced, that might have, I wouldn't say practical, but let's say some kind of, that it might offer something. But the project itself was very much about trying to understand the narratives and the discourses, those intangible forces that nonetheless might be informing, practice and choice in a lot of contexts.
My one's a little bit of a cheeky one. So Deakin is probably going to be interviewing in the coming weeks for whoever gets the Deputy Vice-Chancellor academic job. Which one do we want? Which of these? Which of these do we want? I mean, I would put my pitch in for someone untethered. I think that would be, it feels kind of Deakin, feels kind of untethered, but I think that wouldn't be a uniform view across the institution for sure. Would love some completely non-binding musings from you in that space.
So out of respect to my interviewees, my participants, I do keep having to say, I do sort of have to just, first of all, go back to the fact that, many of their narratives did kind of cross the boundaries of those neat little imaginaries that we're proposing. Although there were some exceptions, there were some who were just so very much grounded in that space that, but that would be, yes, if I was on the interview committee, it would be the untethered academic who I'd be hoping for as well. I mean, as I say, so these are people with deep knowledge. They're people, but so deep knowledge, at times a bitterly felt concern about the wider, going back to Laura's point, question the wider forces that are shaping the academy and what they really might mean going forward, but also a great deal of sense of possibility, digital possibility, academic possibility, still that sort of really surprisingly resilient hope and optimism, and a definite vision.
Are there any more questions in the room or online? Yep, Laura.
Sorry, thank you. Just following up on that last one, and I suppose going back to Dave's question about the practical utility of your work, it just strikes me that as someone who's kind of has had to lead and manage academics previously, thankfully not currently, one potential outcome of this might be if perhaps casting a light on that process, that effective process that academics go through as they're thinking about the change in their workplaces, and gently acknowledging that position of grief and backwards looking, but then perhaps also encouraging people to move into those other imaginaries and to generate that sense of hope and optimism for the future, and therefore grappling with what the future is going to bring. I mean, I'm not saying it from a HR perspective, but in terms of bringing some life back into those people who might be feeling stuck in their roles and might be grappling with what it means to be working in a space that they no longer feel comfortable with. More of a comment than a question, sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, just to briefly reflect on that. I mean, the academic, I mean, Melisande, who wept during our interview. I mean, she thanked me through her tears. I mean, she thanked me for the opportunity. This is a sophisticated player too. We've got to remember that. This is a very senior person. She's, she actually, I mean, she said, this is the first kind of safe space I've had to really feel the grief that I'm carrying. So I don't want to sort of be hierarchical about this, but this is not a beleaguered junior academic at the start of their career. This is someone who you might imagine or assume to have an enormous sense of agency. Is actually not one of my favorite words, but nonetheless, you would think agency, control. And I mean, really what she was saying in the end was that, the grief has to be worked through. It's got to be recognised and it's got to be worked through. I mean, that dark narrative of a lot of the UK academics in particular, there is a very strong, I mean, some of them are, Cliff is virtually saying, could we please just collectively get over it and move on? But there is also like a subtler acknowledgement underneath from a lot of them that people are still hurting for a whole lot of reasons that may have very little to do with the move to the digital in their teaching experience, but that needs to be understood, somehow needs to be worked with or worked through. I think Amina had a question.
I'm trying to figure out how to best word this this question, because the snippet that you shared about Millicent is really striking, and I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about the ways in which like her worldview is impacting upon or influencing like her direct reports or the decisions that she's making about, for example, is she less flexible with moves to online? And if you have any thoughts about, I'm assuming, I don't know, if she's in the UK, if the interview was conducted online and that she found that connection with you in that safe space. And I'm wondering if you've got thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly, the online interview, it's not a space I would normally kind of run to. In this case, it was just necessary, unavoidable. It was what it was. It was interesting. I mean, I'm just going to start with the second little reflection first. I was actually surprised by the degree to which most of the people I spoke to, and not only gave their time very generously, and they're extremely busy people, but there was like an emotional generosity in a lot of the discussions with them. It's like they landed and they just opened up and gave. There wasn't any kind of getting to know you, or the interview just sort of went straight into quite frank, open, felt conversations. Funnily enough, Melisande has no direct reports. She actually talked about the great relief of not having direct reports anymore. And she did make it clear that she was speaking very much for herself. It ended up being, and she was, again, open about that. It ended up being an interview that was a lot less about we or the sector. It was more about her felt experience. But I felt, still extremely valid for all that, and one that I really felt had an enormous amount to kind of share. It's, I mean, I could tell again from the scholarship and from our own experiences here in Australia, in those early years of the pandemic, I mean, the sorts of things that she was speaking to, the loss that she felt was something that was very widely experienced. How she might, in theory, if she did have direct reports, how she might translate those feelings, those views into support or practice. are really hard to say. I mean, I want to sort of, want to theorize. These are incredibly polished professional actors, that they would kind of enact the policy that they were supposed, that they're expected to or asked to, or, I mean, that's just surmise. But I think it was more of a personal space. I mean, actually, just because it might be relevant. So Mel Bissond asked me to do something. I've always offered this and never actually been taken up on it before. So she asked me to send her the transcript, the cleaned up transcript of our interview, so she could then excise the bits that she felt were just too revealing. Obviously, I was happy to do, but it sort of speaks to, it was like we opened a door and a lot of emotion kind of came rushing through.
Yeah, we've got one more question online. This one's from an anonymous attendee who says, thank you for sharing your perspective and rich research. 2 questions. Is there scope on the horizon to interview teachers on the ground? And the second question is just whether you could remind us of the reasoning behind the choice of participants in the study.
Certainly. So, I mean, can't speak for other scholars. I would say that there's endless potential to interview teachers on the ground. I mean, there's been a huge amount of that work that's been undertaken to date, and probably and arguably an ongoing need to keep doing that work. The reason why we made the choice to interview a group that seemed to be very, very unrepresented, but understandably unrepresented in the scholarship was particularly was for a start because they are unrepresented in the scholarship. So frankly, there was so much excellent scholarship that came out of the early years of the pandemic and the overnight shift to digital teaching, which interviewed teachers in schools, teaching academics in universities. I didn't want to do yet another study in that space. I wanted to do something that was a slightly different offering. So that was one rationale, the fact that those people have been very little kind of explored in the scholarship is a kindred, a sort of, a linked rationale. And then it goes back to the third major rationale goes back to that, that argument that the imaginaries that shape our work are often particularly influenced by those in power. I wanted to understand how a very small number of people who may be understood to be amongst those who are in power might be imagining our work collectively, past, present, and future.
I actually think that's a really nice note to end the seminar. It brings us back to the idea of imaginary, and I can hear from some of the questions, and this is something that we did as well when we were engaged in the work. It was very easy to slip between the idea of an imaginary, which is collective, which is held, which is intangible, with also the practicalities at hand. And there is a relationship between the two. That's what's interesting. That's why the work is done. It's not just like it's thought up there. It's thought up there that shapes the possibility of the choices that are made. It shapes the conversations that are had on the ground. So that's I'm sort of following up on that last question and my view on it as well too, and also addressing my view as to why the work is important. And even from the conversation we've had now, it's like it's shining a mirror at us. Here we are in the academy. These are what senior people think and feel. How does that bend and twist and distort our own reflections looking back at us? And also introduces terms like temporal torpidity, which I will remember. So on that note, again, thank you to you all. There are cake for people who are here in the room. There's cake outside. There's tea for people online. One day we hope to see you in here with your cup of tea and your biscuit. Even if you're very far away, it'd still be delightful. Thanks again all, and thanks again to Ros.